very much for this introduction, and thank you for the invitation for hopefully reading my paper, which I promise not to repeat here, but just to pull some things out. In fact, I've noticed, learning so much from yesterday, that I already have both urbanity and city in my title, and I'm not sure quite what Jörg will make of this. But I want to start my pitch for the medieval square with a kind of personal perspective and how I came to work on this. And like many architectural historians, I was sort of trained and focused to work on individual buildings and institutions, whether monasteries or churches or secular buildings. But both while working on a relatively, in architectural terms, modest institution, a monastery in Prague, on Charles Square, that was my doctoral thesis, and then on a spectacular St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. This always led me to their immediate environment, and this broader urban perspective in a way helped me formulate more rewarding questions about complex architectural relationships, how they evolved over time according to civic, religious, and ceremonial aspects of the great medieval cities they occupied. And so let me just kind of think a little bit about historiography here. Now, of course, the study of medieval marketplaces is not a new or a neglected field, and some of the notable experts are present in this very room. However, in looking specifically at architectural historiography of the square, the field appears uneven or to lack fundamental understanding about conceptual logic of Gothic design. There is, for a start, and perhaps understandable focus on Italy. The volume edited by Alessandro Nova and Cornelia Jochner, which I used and quoted in my short piece, and which is entitled Platz und Territorium, centers on an interesting premise that urban structure, and by extension its architectural form, engenders, shapes, Gestalt is the German word that is often used, political space, but follows that up with essays which almost exclusively focus on Italian examples. One of the earliest works on the subject, I'm sure familiar to all of you, this is Brinkmann's Platz und Monument, begins his short, very short, 6-page exposition on medieval square with a number of stereotypes about the lack of overall concept, aversion to symmetry, and a puzzling suggestion that because Gothic architecture is by nature vertical, it does not need any free space around its base, that facades of its churches do not tolerate a distance view, since its steep sharpness, as he says, loses its power when viewed from afar. The squares in this description are irregular, with buildings and houses crowding around, and are not a product of any artistic system. Interestingly, Brinkmann uses Nuremberg's Hauptmarkt, which is one of the examples in my text, as a kind of locus classicus of a medieval square design, despite the fact that its form and its bloody history defy many of the descriptive categories and concepts he puts forward. So my short piece, and let me just move this forward. I might have to move backwards. There's lots of architectural historians. Yeah, but I might need to point, so instead of, so I don't have to do it like this. My short piece that I've submitted here tried to address several aspects of what I deduced as the origins of a large city square in late medieval Central Europe. In the first instance, I kind of used a fairly focused period of this genesis of a royal imperial or imperial square as devised during the reign of the 14th century Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV. This genesis began actually in Italy and through his experiences of Italy, but were influenced also by places like Aachen, which of course itself has classical roots, where the juxtaposition of an atrium and an entrance, and roughly at this level is the imperial throne of Charlemagne, and quite the kind of relationship between the inside and the outside in the Carolingian period is not clear, but it seemed to be entirely separate. What happened in the Gothic period is that a balcony was added from which relics were displayed, such as the bust of Charlemagne, And these things then became quite formalized every 7 years during the Jubilee dedicated to the Virgin. One of the relics in the church, they were displayed, and one of such displays took place when Charles IV was there, and he participated in it. So that kind of idea of an open space in a kind of vertical focal point with relics, with a kind of loaded ceremony, may have been something that influenced him quite early on. The design of Nuremberg, here we are, sometime between 1349 and 1355, reflected some definitions of spatiality, which I was listening carefully yesterday with Martin Christ outline. So this was a contested space, and also politically, formally, and socially constructed. Its construction followed an acts of planned violence, something that I think Martin referred to as well, in this case against the Jewish population who hitherto dwelled here. And the new actors, as Martin termed them, claimed the space not only by physical force and building campaign, but also through symbols, which stated Nuremberg's exalted constitutional position within the empire. And by those I mean, I can't go into them now, but the balcony has coats of arms of the empire, and the Schöne Brunn, and even in this restored form, has the electors. So Nuremberg's many generous rights were based on their relationship with the emperor and were contested by other notional centers in the ritual mythology of the empire, such as Aachen, Cologne, and Frankfurt. In turn, the emperor depended on the increasingly wealthy Nuremberg bankers and their generous loans. So many of these ceremonies, these same symbols, the coats of arms, as I said, and the Schöne Brunn fountain, could also be claimed by the emperor as part of his imperial display within the city and the square during important ceremonies, such as the First Reichstag and the proclamation of the Golden Bull, or the baptism of Charles IV's heir, Wenceslas IV, in the nearby Sebaldeskirche. So the development in Prague are almost coeval with Nuremberg, but Prague had many separate districts, 4 in total, and displays a kind of internal logic of square development, beginning in the Old Town Square, which you see here, and this is what that section of my paper begins with. What I wanted to point out here, and this is the Castle Square, another early of the Old Town institutions, is how whatever the kind of marketplace function originally was the role of Old Town Square, architecture becomes extremely kind of rhetorical, outward-facing, bedecked with symbols of royal and secular power on the town hall, or on like this house, so-called House of the Stone Bell, which only in the 1970s was revealed to be really a medieval house, with the crown, king and queen, probably John of Luxembourg, Charles's father and predecessor, his mother, and 2 sergeant-at-arms, and possibly some saintly figures above. And this becomes very meaningful at the moment of the first kind of seating and the oaths of allegiance taking place in the square in front. Now, moving to the big Charles Square, we see here a greater complexity of design, both of scale, uses, and meaning. I don't want to go into that in detail here because it's explained elsewhere, but in terms of temporality and layers of meaning, I just wanted to point 2 things because that leads me on my final point about ceremony as one of the keys to unlocking all this. So this is Charles Square, this is the Old Town, the square we're just looking at, and Castellus with Wenceslas Square played in kind of Cardo de Cumanus thing across the kind of border parts here. So 2 kind of axes of meaning across this grid were read by scholars in this design. One is a kind of bohemian axis, which starts in the castle, where the royal procession, the funerary procession, crossed Charles Bridge, stopped at various institutions and the square in the city, moved down here. The funeral actually stopped at the town hall, Emmaus Monastery, before retreating to Vyšehrad and then returning back. The second is more exciting, kind of universal heavenly Jerusalem level of the square itself with, let me just move on, here with these kind of institutions. St. Stephen's, which is rededicated to Longinus, has the earth from the Holy Land where the pilgrims who died on pilgrimage to Prague would have been buried, already has a monastery of the custodians of the Holy Sepulchre with a kind of miniature Holy Sepulchre in the building, and finally, the latter part of the 14th century, a Corpus Christi chapel, which is used for this annual display of the Passion relics, a kind of treasury that each Holy Roman Emperor possessed, but which was here displayed publicly in a marketplace in a dedicated ceremony with indulgences for the very first time. So what interests me are spatial relationships and buildings here and how they meet particular demands. But of course, the question is how methodologically I can kind of interpret this, because it's all very well saying that it's, you know, heaven in Jerusalem and it has these evocative dedications and institutions, but how would people actually understand it as being such? And for me, one of the ways of approaching this is ceremony as a way of kind of activating ingredients in a particular moment that a marketplace can be transformed into heavenly Jerusalem or something else where you can get, you know, a remission from sins and lesser time in limbo. And that architectural accents, building individual monuments in their position, and general urban scenography played a vital part in unlocking these. And I want to quote here just towards the end, Andrew Brown's book, Civic Ceremony and Religion in Medieval Bruges, 1300 to 1520, who kind of ponders around same issues around the relic of the Holy Blood and the kind of processions that took place there. And he says, urban memory might attach itself to certain buildings and spaces, but it was movement between these that strengthened or reaffirmed memory, lieu de mémoire, in towns, the civic halls, marketplaces, to an extent churches, became fixed as repositories of an urban sense of identity. But it was by being linked dynamically through repetition of processions that the fixing took place, and that again refers to some of the concepts we were discussing yesterday. Of course, this would then invite further discussion about the nature of ceremony, what it does and how it does what it does. And with a whole rostrum of writers, perhaps for me most relevantly people like Van Gennep and Clifford Geertz. Another, finally, my last paragraph, avenue research, which I'm particularly interested in, is following a life in the square, doing it kind of vertically across time in various zones, temporarily. So focusing on a single space across time and its organized urban life. As well as following physical changes, it would also allow its main actors, focus on its main actors, who, when, how uses it, who claims it, owns it, or in the case of Nuremberg and also in Florence and other places, is dispossessed for the sake of this common vision of a public place. Thank you. That's me done.